When creating a virtual machine and you get to the part about the virtual hard disk, you might not want to take the defaults. You might want to have more control. In fact, we'll review those defaults here shortly. But also, you might want to add additional disks. Well, in Hyper-V, you can. So let's start off by creating a VHD or a VHDX, and we'll kind of take a look at some of the examples that we have along the way. If I want to make a new virtual hard disk, it's under the option New. I can select New Hard Disk. Now the wizard's going to pop up and guide us through this process and let us know that we can create VHDs or VHDXs. And we talked about these a little bit in the first module of this course. Now a VHD supports older styled VMs like from 2008 R2, but there are some restrictions in its size, as you can see here. The new format is VHDX, but you need to have this on running server 2012 R2. It supports a much larger size, up to 64 terabytes, and as it points out, is more resilient to power failures. Now, you can convert these, and I'm going to demonstrate that as well, that if you have a VHD, you can make it into a VHDX. Let's go ahead and start with making our own VHDX. I'm going to click Next, and now we get to choose what type that we want to create, and there's 3 different types. There's fixed size. Now, fixed size means that when we create this, it's going to partition out the disk space. So if we say we want 10 gigs, it's going to take up 10 gigs. And that's opposed to dynamically expanding, where we can say, you know, we want this to grow to a size of 150 gigs, but it's not going to start out at that. It's going to gradually grow up as space is needed. And we'll talk more about dynamic. Now we're going to start with a fixed disk size, and the reasons that you might want to use a fixed disk size is, quite honestly, performance. Performance is going to be better because the disk space is already allocated. Now, you want to be cautious when you're choosing the types of disks that you want. Some applications will tell you that you need to use a fixed disk size for that very performance reason. In the last module, I used Exchange as an example on when you don't want to use dynamic memory for Exchange. Exchange would be another great example of where you want a fixed disk size. And this is really common for any application that has a high level of input output per second, high IOPS requirements. So we'll pick a fixed disk size, click Next, and now we'll give it a name. And I'm going to call this Fixed Disk 1. And you can see the location that's going to create it. Again, this was the location that we set up when we installed the Hyper-V role. You can always change it. I'll click Next, and now it wants to know what size do we want to create this at. Now, when you're creating it, it gives you what the maximum size for a VHDX would be. Now, I'm going to make this much smaller. Let's only make this 10 gig for right now. Also, you have some other options here that you'll notice. You can copy the contents from other drives. You can also copy them from other virtual hard disk when you're creating this. I'm going to click Next. It'll give me a summary page of what it's going to make, and then I'll click Finish. And it's created the disk. Now, if I wanted to, I could go into a server. I could edit its options, or into a VM, I should say, and I could add that disk. So let's take a look here. I can go to the SCSI controller, and I could say Add. And I can actually run that same wizard right through here, where I could create a new disk while I'm here, or I can browse out to the disk that I just made. There's fixed disk 1. I'll say Open, and I can apply this, and now I've assigned this disk to this virtual machine. Now, you'll have to go into the virtual machine now and format that disk and get it all set up in computer management, and we'll take a look at that as well. Another type of disk to create, as you saw, was a dynamic. So let's go back into a hard disk here, and let's hit Next. And we're going to use a VHDX, and here's the default setting. And I want you to notice that when I came here, it default shows dynamically expanding. Now, a dynamically expanding disk conserves the space on your physical host. In other words, we're not allocating all of that disk space right away. We're going to allow this to gradually grow. You may not know exactly how much disk space you need, so this will allocate it as required. But like we had mentioned earlier, for applications that need a lot of input output per second, this can be performance hindering to those. So you want to be a little bit careful with it. Now, dynamically expanding is the default. I want you to notice something. I'm going to cancel out of this. And in the last module, we created a virtual machine and we went past this pretty quick. I'm going to go into a virtual, just to make a new virtual machine. And it doesn't matter whether, at this point, whether I'm doing Gen 1 or Gen 2. There's its startup memory and its network, but take a look at the default option when it comes up to creating a virtual disk. It's going to create a dynamically expanding one. And like I said, this may not be what you want, and that's why you would create your own disk and set it up the way that you want it ahead of time. Well, let's go ahead and create that dynamically expanding disk. We'll go back in, we'll select a VHDX, dynamically expanding. We'll give it a name, and I'm just going to call this the Dino disk. Dino disk. Click next, and now it tells you that once again, what is the maximum size that this is going to be. And let's go ahead and leave it at 127 gigabytes. It's certainly not going to take all that disk space right away, which is a good thing because I'm not so sure my host has that available. And now we've created the disk. Now let's go out to where those disks are created. I'm going to open up Explorer, and this is the default location. So local disk, I'm going to go underneath users, public documents, Hyper-V, virtual hard disks. And take a look, here is that Dino disk, and notice its size. I know it's hard to read because it's kind of grayed out, but see, it's very, very small. Until I start using it, then it will start to dynamically grow, as opposed to the fixed disk, which is, I wanted 10 gigs, and there's what it is. So you can see that creating a new virtual disk, whether it's a disk that you want to use for when you set up the VM for the very first time, or if it's a virtual disk that you want to add to the VM, you can create fixed and dynamic. Now, what's coming up next is that third option is a differencing disk.